Hi, I'm Annie Winstrup, and this is the visual component of my grant proposal for Ascent of the Blessed, an ambiguous rise to the hereafter that considers Hieronymus Bosch's panel Ascent of the Blessed for consideration at the Dr. Jones Institute of Lost Treasure. The Ascent of the Blessed is part of a polytriptych or a four-paneled altarpiece entitled Visions of the Hereafter. The other panels that comprise the polytriptych are Fall of the Damned into Hell, Hell, Terrestrial Paradise, and Ascent of the Blessed. It's worth noting that there's disagreement over how the four panels should be arranged by art historians, as well as whether or not all the panels belong in the same grouping. The exteriors of the panels suggest that somehow all four panels are related, besides the thematic work on the interior, because the exteriors are all painted to resemble marble in colors of red and green. This is unusual for any kind of triptych or polytriptych of the time. In the Netherlands, the exterior of triptychs and polytriptychs were usually painted in a technique called crisel, where the colors are gray and the effect is that the painting resembles that of sculpture. Probably the most famous example also of this technique comes from Hieronymus Bosch in his triptych, The Garden of Earthly Delights, where the exterior of the triptych shows the creation of Earth, probably on the third day. What's also strikingly different about Visions of the Hereafter is that Bosch tended to embellish the exterior of his triptychs with as much importance on the scene on the exterior as he did on the interior. So having an exterior that was maybe vague in meaning or even absence of meaning is odd. For the inside of the panels, all four panels were initially painted black, and then the paintings on top of it, and then they were painted on top of that black background. So this accounts for the darkness of the scenes, even the scenes of both earthly and heavenly paradise, where you see that the terrestrial paradise, the colors are maybe more muted or they have a darker hue than they would otherwise. And in the Ascent of the Blessed, it's a very dark painting despite showing what is presumably a joyous occasion. Before talking about Ascent of the Blessed exclusively, I'd like to draw your attention to some of the commonalities between the four panels, starting with how the human figures are displayed. The figures are elongated, not as elongated as maybe Goya, but they're slightly longer, the proportions are slightly different, and I think that the features for all the humans are lacking notable sex differentiation, and this gives a sense of ambiguity over the figures and what they represent. It's not, there is some differentiation in the first three panels, but by the time you look at the Ascent of the Blessed, all distinguishing characteristics between the individuals have changed. Whereas if you look at the Descent into Hell, there's maybe a little bit of sex differentiation, there's a little bit of difference in how the faces appear, but that effect changes as you move from the panels looking from the left to the right. I think another aspect already touched on is just how dark the panels are. Some of it might be because of the passage of time, but I think a lot of it has to do with that black background. This gets at one of the topics I want to cover with the Ascent of the Blessed, with just how ambiguous the meaning of the painting is, and how that's really a hallmark of Bosch's style, as well as emblematic of the Northern Renaissance in general. So a closer look at Ascent of the Blessed. So it's really hard to fit a vertical panel within a horizontal screen, but I'll try my best. One of the things that stood out to me most is that the panel is divided into three regions. If you look, there are three different kind of scenes within the one panel that are stacked vertically, but there's not a vertical movement from the bottom of the panel upwards that's suggested by the lineation within there. Instead, it looks like they're really stacked on top of each other. I think this is disconcerting because the title is Ascent, and so I'm imagining that the body should be going from the earthly plane up into the heavenly plane, and there's no movement, like maybe a diagonal that goes upwards. Instead, the figures are stacked, and the difference between how they're foregrounded and backgrounded is also slightly disconcerting. Adding to that effect of a more horizontal piece in a vertical frame is how the tunnel appears to look at the viewer rather than being pivoted down towards the ground. So the idea of the figures ascending into the tunnel doesn't really work. Instead, it looks like maybe they approach it into a portal, but it also gives the effect that that tunnel is opening up to me as the viewer. Theologically, I don't think it's unsound, but it is perplexing, and it also suggests that I as the viewer can enter the tunnel and become part of the blessed, which is disconcerting. And I think that's really like the hallmark of what Bosch does best, and why even though his paintings have such a strong religious theme, they still exemplify an aspect of humanist philosophy, because as a viewer, I feel the tension between the human experience and theological teaching. And it prioritizes in some ways the discomfort that I as an individual feel while looking at these divine images and ideas. And so the emphasis isn't just on the promise of ascension or an afterlife. Instead, it's my response as a human being to those ideas that's being displayed, just as much as the story of what happens after the judgment. So on the right side of the screen, you can see a close-up of the tunnel. Some art critics have compared it to drawings of the zodiac. To me, it looks more like a giant eye, maybe a negative image of the eye with the brightest part being the pupil instead of the darkest part. But it does gives that a sense of being watched. Here, the top 2/3 of the panel, you can see the tunnel above the angels. And then the lower right panel. To me, this part of the panel really doesn't feel like it belongs under the title of Ascent of the Blessed. Maybe it looks more like, to me it looks more hellish. The angel's wings are reminiscent of bat wings, and the posture of the person ascending doesn't look joyful to me. It looks more like they're being tortured or like they're surrendering themselves. It also is slightly reminiscent of the Passion of the Christ, where the chest is tilted upwards, the face is tilted upwards, but it's not an expression of joy. And I think the line of the leg and the flexion of the foot also suggests that where Christ is on the cross and he's unable to support himself. It's disconcerting to see this and imagine how the act of ascending into heaven can be happening with this kind of posture, right? The human being has been displaced from their environment and surroundings in a way that looks very uncomfortable. I think that because of the ambiguity within Bosch's panel, it belongs within the Institute. I do think that it would show best with the other 3 panels. However, I understand that there are constraints with both the budget and the amount of time for this project, and I think that the Ascent of the Blessed is a strong enough piece to support being shown by itself.